good morning from Oklahoma. My name is Curtis Zuniga. I am an enrolled member of the Delaware Tribe of Indians. That's our modern name for who we are, known as the Lenape. And the Lenape, our original homeland, included the area that's now Philadelphia. So I'm honored to be a part of this project. I'm honored to be part of this webinar to open up. Just wanted to say real quick that when I went out for my morning prayers this morning and offered tobacco, I prayed for the Creator to guide me to say the right thing during this webinar, especially an opening prayer. I used the word in our language called Wichamen, which was help me. But as I got through my prayer, I started using the term Wichaminen, which is help us. My prayer was to help everyone through this extraordinary time. Soon I was given an inspiration to read a poem, and I consulted with the poem's author this morning. I was texting her. Her name is Joy Harjo. She's Muskogee Creek, and she is the current U.S. Poet Laureate for the United States. So I found a poem that I was really inspired by, and I'm going to read it to serve as an opening prayer. This is called For Calling the Spirit Back from Wandering the Earth in Its Human Feet. Put down that bag of potato chips, that white bread, that bottle of pop. Turn off the cell phone, the computer, and remote control. Open the door, then close it behind you. Take a breath offered by friendly winds. They travel the earth, gathering essences of plants to clean. Give it back with gratitude. If you sing, it will give your spirit lift to fly to the stars' ears and back. Acknowledge this earth who has cared for you since you were a dream, planting itself precisely within your parents' desire. Let your moccasin feet take you to the encampment of the guardians who have known you before time, who will be there after time. They sit before the fire that has been there without time. Let the earth stabilize your post-colonial insecure jitters. Be respectful of the small insects, birds, and animal people who accompany you. Ask their forgiveness for the harm we humans have brought down upon them. Don't worry, the heart knows the way. Though there may be high rises, interstates, checkpoints, armed soldiers, massacres, wars, and those who will despise you because they despise themselves. The journey might take you a few hours, a day, a year, a few years, 100, 1,000, or even more. Watch your mind. Without training, it might run away and leave your heart for the immense human feast by the thieves of time. Do not hold regrets. When you find your way to the circle, to the fire kept burning by the keepers of your soul, you will be welcomed. You must clean yourself with cedar, sage, or other healing plant. Cut the ties you have to failure and shame. Let go the pain you are holding in your mind, your shoulders, your heart, all the way to your feet. Let go the pain of your ancestors to make way for those who are heading in our direction. Ask for forgiveness. Call upon the help of those who love you. These helpers take many forms: animal, element, bird, angel, saint, stone, or ancestor. Call your spirit back. It may be caught in corners and creases of shame, judgment, and human abuse. You must call in a way that your spirit will want to return. Speak to it as you would to a beloved child. Welcome your spirit back from its wandering. It may return in pieces, in tatters. Gather them together, They will be happy to be found after being lost for so long. Your spirit will need to sleep a while after it is bathed and given clean clothes. Now you can have the party. Invite everyone you know who loves and supports you. Keep room for those who have no place else to go. Make a giveaway, and remember, keep the speeches short. Then you must do this. Help the next person find their way through the dark.
Thank you, Curtis. That was a perfect way for us to begin. I think Curtis has set us off on the right note. The library company was the first public library anywhere, and it was the first lending library anywhere. It was founded by Ben Franklin back in 1731 when he was just in his 20s, and he founded it as a way to gather people together to learn together, to learn in this new city and to learn how to live and be the best people they could be. And that spirit has been part of our history throughout its nearly 300 years. This gathering of people online is, I think, another expression of that, people gathering together to learn from each other and to learn about the past. So I'm grateful to all of you who have signed in here today. I hope you might, after today's symposium is over, come back to the Library Company website and follow us on social media so you can see all of the content that we now are pushing out. We mostly these days work as a research library, but our reading rooms are closed right now. But we have a lot of great content, from our new Fireside Chat series to our seminars and online images, which are open access. I would love for you to come and spend some time looking at what we have to offer there. I've not given Will Fenton enough thanks yet, but this is Will's project. This is a project that came out of Will's work as a fellow at the Library Company. I wanted to thank, I see that Bill Adair from the Pew Center or formerly of the Pew Center of Arts and Heritage is here. Bill was the officer at the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage that helped us to shepherd this project through the grant process, and the Pew Center was very generous in funding it. And I'm really pleased, although Bill has very recently left the Pew Center, I'm very glad he's here to carry forward what he helped us to begin. I'm really pleased that Washoyot Alvitra is here. Washoyot is the artist of the Ghost River comic book. I'm not sure that Lee is going to be able to, I'm not sure that Lee has joined us yet, but Lee was Lee has been the publisher, the writer. Between Lee and Washoyot really produced this comic, and we're incredibly graphic novel, and we're incredibly grateful to them for it. I wanted the project team, in addition to Will, Dayjah Brock, Rachel Hammer, Katie Maxwell, Jennifer Rosner, Tristan Don, and then we have Ann McShane and Nicole Scalessa. The last two, Ann and Nicole, were with the Library Company when we started this project and really got it underway. Nicole was our project manager for most of the life of this project. They've gone on to bigger things, if not necessarily better. We're really happy to have Ann and Nicole back, Ann and Nicole back for this event. I also wanted to thank Mangrove Media, which produced our documentary, which is available on YouTube, and I hope we have some links made of that available. And I want to thank Keith Ragone, who designed the exhibition, Laura Farragon, who has helped us to promote it, and the Mcneil Center for Early American History and the Gilder Lehrman Foundation, who also helped to produce our seminar for high school teachers this past summer. That's a long list. And I don't want to leave out Curtis, of course, who began with our invocation. Curtis is a member of our advisory team who's really been one of our most powerful guiding spirits of this project, and we're grateful for the time and the thoughtfulness and the spirit that he has brought to this project. You know, the Library Company has been around for almost 300 years. We made it through the yellow fever epidemic of 1793. We made it through smallpox. We made it through the influenza epidemic of 1918. Throughout all of those times, we've been a place that distributes information and gathers a community of learners. So I'm very much looking forward to this event today as just the next iteration of that convening of a community of learners. And I thank all of you who've made that possible. And I look forward to a wonderful day. Thank you to all of you.
I have, I guess, a couple of hats to wear, although I'm not wearing a hat now in this project. I'm director of the Mcneil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, which is an interdisciplinary research center. One of the great things about being involved with this project for me is that we primarily deal with graduate students and postdoctoral fellows and faculty, and are always looking for ways to reach out to a broader community, but that's we're usually at one step removed from that, in that we're dealing with PhD students and professional scholars. I've worked very, very closely with the library company, of course, over many years. They're one of the members of our consortium and a vital member of our operation. I also should say I'm a library company trustee, so I have lots of entangling alliances with this project, and it's been great to work in that way as well. So. I was involved early on as one of the academic consultants to the project, and it was great, particularly to reach out to some new areas for me, and that graphic novels are not something that I have really had any particular experience with before. So it's been great to learn from that project. I think my primary role in this was as the lead instructor for the Gerda Lehrman Institute Teacher Workshop this summer, which was just an amazing experience to work with these teachers from all over the country, several of them from native reservations, people from all walks of life, different kinds of schools, from very elite private schools to very under-resourced public schools.
Dan, I was hoping that you might talk a little bit about your experience with teaching that teacher seminar. How was teaching a group of teachers from across the country different from your typical undergraduate or graduate course?
Well, they were way more enthusiastic than my typical undergraduates, I can say that. It was just an amazing week with these people. They're so energized, so interested. I think we tried to set this up as kind of like going back to college for them, and they were just soaking it up and asking great questions. In fact, I could never get through my lectures on time because there was just so much interaction. And so it was great to deal with them, and great to deal with them also in the context of this seminar, where I tried to make it clear that they were the experts on how to teach. And I was just going to try to give them some ways of thinking through this material, particularly, and to set the whole issue of the Conestoga Massacre in a broader context of how we can understand early American history and the ways in which settler colonists and native people and the European empires interacted to set up this really catastrophic event in the 1760s. So it was terrific. And again, I think I've kept in touch with a lot of these people. They've let me know what they're doing, and it's been it was just a wonderful experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember being struck by the ambition of that week-long seminar, because you basically covered 400 years of settler colonial theory in 5 days. Is that right?
Yes, it was an exhausting, and I've never worked harder in my life, although now I'm working pretty hard taking my classes online. That was a lot more work than this, trying to get all that material into something that was reasonably comprehensible within 1 week. And I think we came close to doing something worthwhile with that.
Well, Curtis, I was wondering if I could bring you into the conversation. I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about your experience coming out to Philadelphia. In our first meeting, I guess it would have been about 2 years ago now, we were in our Logan room having that first conversation as a group, discussing our charter, thinking about the values and ambitions of the project. I'm curious to know what really jumped out at you, and how you think we did in relation to those values.
Wow. All right. Well, first of all, I want to say that it was a honor and a privilege to participate in this project and to bring a certain consultancy to the project because of who I am as a Lenape man, but with some cultural and historical knowledge, and so to be asked to represent my nonprofit that I'm a co-director of, the Lenape Center in New York, it was exciting to be able to also bring this project down to, or bring me down to Philadelphia for this project. Then when I learned more about the graphic novel format, I was excited about it because it appeals to a different and a younger generation of people, which helps keep the story fresh. So when I came and met everyone, I was most impressed. I must, as I remind myself, I want to remind you that I had just broken my arm like about 2 weeks or 2-3 weeks before. So, you know, when I came there, I had my arm in a cast all the way up to my shoulder. And that wasn't a pleasant experience, but I endured, and I was most impressed, like going over to the Philadelphia Historical Society and meeting Brian over there and seeing the collection over there. But I was, quite frankly, I was humbled to be in the midst of so many academics and scholarly people who had a true, heartfelt buy-in into this project. I think that after the research that was done, once it was put into the hands of Lee Francis, it came to life in a way that I would have never considered. It was just amazing. And then to turn it over to Wishoyo to create artwork, goodness gracious, that was probably, you know, equally impressive as the story itself. So I believe that the project has given attention to this true story in history in a way that has not been presented ever before. I recall when we went out to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and met with the group out there, that was a big plus in the development of this project. And so that was pretty special. So my thoughts on this whole thing, it's been a rousing success. However, I do want to say something real quick, Will. It seems like when it was hit the media, and as we were pushing it out, the attention by outside folks and the media was on the format of the graphic novel itself, on the way it was artistically presented, on the inclusion of Native people in this project. But it seemed like that overshadowed the actual story itself. And I think it's important that we all continue to point at this story, this real time in history, what actually happened in history. And I would like for us to think that some of the residual effect of that kind of racism, hatred, and even attempted genocide at the earliest part of this United States of America, things that were done against the Native people to deprive them of land, culture, and ultimately their lives, that some of that still exists today. And we can use this amazing story to remind us that we can do better. We should not let that kind of racism still exist in this country, and it does. So if we're reminded about things that have happened in the past, we realize that time travels in a circle, not on a linear plane, but in a circle. And some of the things from the past are coming back to haunt us again today. if we know that and realize it, we can do better tomorrow.
If I were telling this story, it'd be much more linear. And this is a story that begins in a place I wouldn't have anticipated and runs right up into the present. And I know that you had a lot of conversations, Curtis, with both Weshoyo and Lee, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the structure of time in the graphic novel.
Well, as I was following it, it was like seeing this story develop in real time. I mean, the book starts out with, the original story, which I was so privileged to share with Weshoyo about the creation story of the Lenape people and others that are Eastern Woodlands Algonquin speaking people, thus the creation story of the great turtle rising from the waters and the tree of life that springs from its back. The image that she drew after she and I also spent some time after our gathering in Philadelphia, we spent some time on the internet talking about this story. And the image that she created was so striking, so amazing that, I put it up on the wall in my office. That's how fantastic it is. And again, with regards to my discussion about time on a linear scale and time as a circle, which is the way a lot of Indian thinking it is, because it links the generations. So if we are reading this story and realize that it is a true story, then we understand that the sacrifices, the atrocities that were committed on our ancestors for holding on to their language, their culture, their land, their ancestral obligations to maintain sovereignty over the place where the Creator gave them to live in harmony and spiritual balance with all of life. When that was upset with colonial intrusion, in particular, these damn Paxton Boys, and the hatred and the racism and the genocidal attitudes that they brought was a tremendous stain on the history of the United States of America, but it was part of what was going on in the new United States. But if we look at that and we look throughout history, there is still the same kind of thinking that goes on in current generations. And so we look at how, it comes back and it haunts us in one way or another. Many of our native people are starting to say, this is an awakening, this whole coronavirus thing, and the way that Earth is in upheaval with climate change and other types of things. Native people and elders and spiritual people are saying, this is a time of reckoning, of great change, and we must recognize it and look to the lessons of the past in order to forge a place forward. And I think the theme of that was actually part of my opening prayer, which was the fantastic poem by Joy Harjo. There is redemption after this, but we think about what happened in the past and we bring it back around to start another cycle. And this time we vow to do better, to honor the ancestors and their sacrifices and make a place ready for the next generation to come along. That's what I got out of this story. And I read it and I felt it in the content, not only of Lee's writing, but again, the incredible artwork done by Weshoyo.
That's great. So I'd like to bring in Ron Nash. Ron Nash is a senior educational fellow at the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And as such, he was instrumental in helping us organize that teacher seminar that Dan was speaking so eloquently to just a little while ago. Ron, I was hoping that you might be able to talk a little bit about that next generation, because I know you've been, traveling all over the country, going to social studies conferences. I did one with you. We did the National Social Studies Conference together. And I'd love to hear about how teachers are responding to this book.
Yeah, no, I hope you can hear me. The teacher response has been very, very, welcoming and eye-opening for them. We were in Austin when we did the presentation with the NCSS and the National Supervisors Conference, and we had an opportunity to, meet with a whole group of teachers and supervisors of social studies from around the country. And I think, as you have just said, that your experience there was that there were a lot of great questions. There were a lot of things that teachers had not thought of. And to go back to something that you were saying, Curtis, there's a direct connection to a lot of essential questions that connect to today, in terms of fear and responses of people to what they fear in terms of violence, and then a whole bunch of other arrays of questions. But, just to quickly go back to another conference I recently attended in California with the California Council of Social Studies Teachers, we had a significant number of people show up. I ran out of materials to give them. So I'm, encouraging everybody to download, at ghostriver.org. But I mean, again, as we saw in Austin, teachers have, this incredible connection to the story. Our curriculum that John McNamara, I want to give a shout out to one of my colleagues, John McNamara, that he and I, we wanted also to kind of have something compelling in terms of a title for what we produced in terms of the curriculum. So Murder on the Frontier, and we wanted to call it for what it was. It was not, the Paxton Boys, and it was not, a whole bunch of other things that have been incorporated into the traditional story that textbooks tell. But, again, all of these things woven together, the opportunity to meet with, Lee and Washoyet and Curtis and a whole bunch of other people, and to go out, walk the land and get a sense of, the land and how that landscape plays such an important role. And then, to come back and then with John and myself to take the materials from the different institutions to, and especially from you, Will, in terms of, the Ghost River, and to be able to look at primary sources, look at the story, reach out to other historians to get a better sense of how to approach this, with the way we want it, the ultimate product to be able to be delivered to teachers and ultimately to students, so that they would have this opportunity to, to dig down into the facts, dig down into the documents, use the essential questions that we developed, to maybe even force other questions to be asked. And I think that, in our conversations, as Will, and, as I was beginning to describe in California, there was a tremendous reception. So I'm really happy about that. And I'm hoping that this continues, obviously.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate that we have, that we're short a couple of advisors right now, because Joel Nichols, who works at the Free Library of Philadelphia, has been instrumental in getting the books distributed around Philadelphia. We now have more than 100 copies of Ghost River circulating through all the different branches of the Free Library of Philadelphia. And of course, Vilma Ortiz Sanchez at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, who will be here today, was also invaluable in helping us connect with the Smithsonian and that larger network of people. It's funny because if memory serves, I believe that they actually had experience working with Shoyo in particular on a Native curriculum before any of this happened. So it's unfortunate that we don't have the full team here, but I'm glad that we have the team that we do. And given that we're all sort of reconvened, I'm curious to know if anything sort of jumps out at you from that original set of site visits that we did, that original meeting. We'd started talking about this a little bit earlier, Ron, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to jump in.
Oh yeah, no, I listened, as Curtis was, describing some things, and I'm concurring. Obviously that was a very powerful day, and well, 2 days. First in the library company to get to know everybody and to be able to begin to address some of the issues surrounding the project. But then going out, you know, to Lancaster, I mean, meeting the Circle Legacy folks, you know, as I mentioned, walking the landscape is so important. You know, when you talk about something, you know, or you read about something in a textbook, you know, if you don't walk the land, you don't really understand, you know, a lot of things. And that was so powerful in terms of, you know, being able to really understand, you know, the nature of what happened on those 2 days in 1763 and all the other events surrounding it. So, I mean, it was, you know, you can tell from my expression here, it left me with an indelible, you know, type of you know, positive response, you know, that this is very powerful. The graphic novel, obviously, you know, was going to be able to be important, you know, to have, you know, readers digest that, take a look at some of the other things that are part of that story. And then, you know, like I said, the asking and drilling down of other additional questions is very important. I think that's happening across the country. As you mentioned, you know, I think we, you know, were able to distribute, I don't know, 70 books at the NCSS conference. I know I gave away another 65 at the California Council. So anyway, you know, that and it got you know, tremendous receptivity, you know, by all the teachers. You know, like I said, very emotional, and even though it's an East Coast story, you know, if I, you know, like geographically suggest that, but you know, a lot of the California teachers said, no, this is a direct connection to the things that we're doing and that we're mandated to do in terms of Native American history in California, so that they saw that there's an easy way to, you know, to make those connections with their students. So.
Curtis, have you had any opportunities to share the project with folks around the Delaware Tribe of Indians?
I have. Of course, I formally placed a copy into the permanent library of the Delaware Tribe, and I shared it with friends and family and tribal members. You know, again, the curiosity is about the graphic novel format. So there were a lot of people who were impressed with that format, the beautiful artwork, the layout of the book, and me trying to explain that this is just a different way, using the title, Redrawing, a different way of telling about history. Of course, when I shared it locally, ultimately the cachet of Curtis appearing as a character in the book itself, in the story itself, that also distracted people just a little bit of like, oh, cool, is that you? And but I think what was extremely important was, after getting past the artwork and the kind of the outer shell of the story, was getting people to drill down into history and learn about their own history. And we have a lot of people in our tribe that don't even know about the history of the Lenape in that colonial era, pre-1776, what went on. And so I think that was the most impacting part of it. Again, after people kind of look past the fact that, you know, I was in the book and there's some really cool artwork, but it was met positively. But I think we need to do some kind of a local event too, surrounding this book. And I would certainly love to invite anyone here from this panel to come out and visit us out in Delaware Indian Country in Oklahoma now, where we have been displaced since those original years, and help me present this book in some kind of a reading or presentation. I know it would be well received, and certainly the local library is already open to that idea.
That's great. And a preview of coming attractions, or I guess a project that's very much underway, is built into this grant. We had planned to send out a copy of Ghost River, you know, gratis to every federally recognized tribe. And so Lee Francis, who's also our publisher, in addition to being our fantastic author, is in the process of shipping out copies to all 573 federally recognized tribes. And I know that we're making a lot of progress there, and it's an important factor, but it also speaks to a gap in our outreach strategy, because frankly, Curtis, if you weren't on this project, I would have never connected with the folks at the Circle Legacy Center, who were incredibly important partners in this project and really treated us with a sense of generosity and hospitality that I really couldn't have imagined. I mean, given that, you know, here I am, this guy that's got this idea for a graphic novel. You know, I did my grad school in New York. They don't know who the heck I am, and they welcomed us so generously. And I'll never forget that potluck that we all had together. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of relationship that I don't think would have happened without your wide network, Curtis. And I think it also speaks to the role of these sort of kinship networks in reaching tribes that might not have federal recognition or even state recognition. So I think we have a lot of work to do. Go ahead.
Ron stated it so eloquently when he talked about the importance of going out to Lancaster, to going out to the land and walk the land and get a feel for the land. Again, these themes were brought out in the poem that I read when we started. But to look at a monument with a placard that talked about the Conestoga people who were massacred, to get a feel for the lay of the land, and to walk over and see that reconstructed longhouse, mm-hmm. to understand how people lived back then and why the land was so important to them. That was an extremely important part of our initial gathering. And yes, the Circle Legacy people were so welcoming and so generous and so gracious that I was quite happy that we got it set up. They were enthusiastic and they helped bring the content more into focus. So yes, let's not forget them. And also I hope that we can post a link somewhere to their website and let all of the participants and all of the all the people involved in this webinar, that they know that this organization exists and they might continue to learn more about what they're doing and how it applies to the history of Pennsylvania today.
Yes, that's a great point. And incidentally, for those of you who are listening right now, you can pull this up in another tab. It's Circle Legacy Center, all one word, .org. They're just an amazing group. And when Ann McShane is talking about our digital edition with Nicole Scalessa later today, I'm hoping that she'll also show some of the interviews that we have with the folks
history
in the
that
Center, because we had an
up
opportunity
until
to come
very
out
recently.
again, I believe it was last spring, and conduct some follow-up interviews about how they remember this incident and how it was or wasn't taught in local schools. And they're really powerful short videos that, of course, we couldn't fit into the book, because the book doesn't have that accommodation, but the digital edition is well suited to that. And so I think that elevating those voices and creating a space for contemporary Indigenous peoples in this project. So it's not just a historical project, but it's a historical project that has contemporary responsibilities. Mm-hmm. That digital edition really allows us to make that connection explicit. This brings us to a sort of wider question that I'd like to ask you to start getting us on, Curtis, which is like, let's say that, one of Dan's graduate students or undergraduate students is watching this, or, somebody at the Mcneil Center for Early American Studies wants to do a project like this, and they're interested in doing sort of outreach to Indigenous communities. What are some do's and don'ts? Like, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? Are there things that this project would be informative for others to replicate, or are there other things that folks could do a little bit more responsibly?
Well, I guess you did the right thing by bringing me in. to serve as a guide. You know, that's the way I saw it, a guide into Indian country, to meet with the local people and to be guided to the right places and the right people to keep this effort as efficient and economical as possible. And I was, because of my networking over the years and having been there several times before, I mean, I was there to help bless and consecrate the ground on which that longhouse was built before it was ever built. So that's what I would encourage people to do wherever they are in the country. If they want to connect with Native communities and Native people, is to befriend a well-intended and well-meaning person within that community to help guide you through the protocols that certainly exist in order to overcome any hesitancy and resistance. Again, you're talking about bringing a story of non-Indian people who came in to take away from the native inhabitants. And we don't forget these things year after year, generation after generation. I mean, even things that are going on right now with this coronavirus and monies that are supposed to go out and help communities, your Indian reservations are still left way in the back of the line. So, you know, we don't forget these things when other people outside our community are interested in who we are and what we're doing. But if you can find that person who will be your guide and bring you into the circle, that efficiency and economy of time and energy, I think helped result in this project coming along or getting off the ground quickly. And then once it got off, just leave it to the professionals to do their thing. And I'm most impressed that the outcome was far more than I would have ever thought or expected.
God, yeah. I mean, and so much of that owes to that tight working relationship between West Shoyo and Lee. They have that history, that professional history of working together. And I had to learn their shorthand in order to even act as a sort of outside observer. And I'm sure that that's something that we'll hear more about in the next panel. Ron, I would like to bring you back into the conversation here. I wonder if you could think about our teacher seminar that we had and the kinds of teachers that we brought in from across the country and how that compared to other teacher seminars that you've been involved in, because I know that you've done.
I was there only for the 2-day period, and I'm hoping Justin Emmerich is maybe one of our participants today and can jump in later. But you know, the seminar, obviously, you know, from what I could see, and then I know from afterwards when we had evaluations of the seminar, you know, there was just everybody, you know, again, walked away from that very much affected by not only the story, you know, I want to shout out to Dan as well as the, you know, the intellectual lead for the program, but I mean the conversations that took place, you know, both during the day and in the evening, you know, they extended beyond the you know, the whatever period of time from 9 to, you know, 4 or whatever each day. I mean, I know that the participants, you know, they saw much to be, you know, there to be presented, but also, you know, other things that they produced afterwards as well. I mean, I was really impressed with the number of teachers whose project for the seminar, you know, focused on this particular event, you know, with regard to, you know, to Ghost River and to some of the other issues that it raised. So, I mean, you know, overall, I guess the bottom line, it's, again, for me, it was very powerful to participate as an advisor for many of the, if not all of the participants. We had about 32 teachers that participated from all over the country. So, I mean, that was important. And again, teachers from different experience levels, teachers from different school environments. Some were private schools, some were public schools, some were independent schools. But again, everybody across the board saw tremendous value in all of this. And I think that's an important takeaway. Oh, one other thing before I forget, I know we were talking about a number of things. One thing that I did do with the teachers in California that I didn't do, or that we didn't do when we had the audience there in Austin, that 10-minute the background to the whole project that's on YouTube, I used about 5 minutes of that, and that really engendered a lot of discussion as well, because it does go back to the landscape, because it does go back, to showing people this is the, whatever, you mentioned, Curtis, about the longhouse. You mentioned about, our gathering in that grave site, the inspiration for Washoyot on the hill. All of those things are there, and those landscapes. People started to connect when we started to talk about the content of the graphic novel, and then they could think back and said, oh wow, I could make a direct connection to what I just saw, in that introductory video. I think it's called The Making of Ghost River. So that had a very powerful impact. So just as an aside, so.
Dan Richter's amazing book, Facing East from Indian Country, which I think is a very sort of similar project in its in the way that it looks at colonial history, because it's looking out at colonial history from the perspective of the indigenous peoples who inhabited the Americas. And it's an incredible book, and we used it in the course, and it wasn't until I really went through it carefully in that course that I recognized just how nicely suited it was, aligned with the very values of this graphic novel. Let's not keep talking about the sort of process that enabled this project to work, because I certainly had some doubts throughout. We had a very hectic schedule. We had basically 18 months to produce a graphic novel, to run a national teacher seminar, and to open an exhibition. And one of the things that almost stopped my heart towards the end of the process was we were working to try to get the graphic novel in-house at the library company in time for our annual dinner, which tends to happen in November. And last year it happened in October, so I lost a couple of weeks that I was counting on. And then I received a batch of 250 copies that we were going to share with everyone. And of course it had a printer's error, and my heart stopped. Because all of the beautiful spreads that Washoyot had created, including that Turtle Island, broke across the page, which is not the way that Washoyot wanted her art to be seen. And fortunately, we were working with a fantastic press named Tribal Print Source, which is a native print shop based on a res nonprofit, and they were able to turn around amended copies like right away. We got them in no time. But I'm curious, for those of you who are sort of serving as our advisors, Ron, Curtis, Dan, if you're there, we had a lot of ambitions for this project when we set out. What seemed perhaps a little bit too Pollyannish from the outset, and what do you think we still have to do in terms of work? I don't take that as a failure, but as really an opportunity for this project to keep living. What work do we have yet to do?
If I could just respond, kind of go back a little bit to some of the earlier threads of this, because I think they do also have to do with where as we go forward from here. I was not able to join the group when they went out to Lancaster a couple of years ago, but I have trod that ground, and the first time I met folks from Circle Legacy was at a conference that the Mcneil Center sponsored back in 2013 on the really the 250th anniversary of all these events, which involved both the Conestoga Massacre, the war called Pontiac's or Pontiac's War, the massive independence movement by Native peoples that was going on at this time, and which was absolutely crucial to the context of what happened at Conestoga. The Paxton Boys is a political movement. One of the most moving parts of that was that we not only went to the Longhouse and had a little ceremony there, but the closing sessions of the academic conference were held at the theater in Lancaster, which is virtually on the site of where the second Conestoga Massacre happened at the jailhouse. And it was a I think the importance of being there and being on that scene was really crucial for my understanding. And again, I regret not having joined this group as it went back to that territory a few years later. But I guess, and thank you for the plug for my book, but I want to just stress that when I say Facing East from Indian Country, I'm never pretending that I can recover the worldview of Native people at that time. What I am encouraging people to do, and what I think this graphic novel does really powerfully, is to, as we as readers and as 20th century people and as 20th century Native people, as well as 20th century non-Native people, as we're trying to think about the story of America, we need to situate ourselves in Indian country and see how these things looked if we put Native people at the center of the story. And that's what I try to do in my book, and what I think the graphic novel does very powerfully. But one of the things I was trying to do in the seminar for the teachers was really stress the much broader context of all of this, and to think about how the three parties that we were trying to trace through this long history in our race through 1 week of trying to cover all this material were the Native peoples, the settler colonists, and the empires, the political structures within which all of these people were trying to operate, right? And I think that one of the things that I want to really stress and reinforce what Curtis said much earlier about putting in the forefront the racism and the murderous tendencies of these people we call the Paxton Boys. But it's also important to think about that as a political movement within Pennsylvania and within the British Empire as a whole, and to try to understand how that racism and that rage works within the politics of that colony, and how it works within creating a kind of populist movement of which that racism is a centerpiece, right? And as historians trying to understand how that kind of thing can happen, and how perhaps as we look at people marching on Charlottesville and other places today, we might get some lessons about how we can perhaps all work together to counter that kind of political force that the Paxton Boys represented in Pennsylvania. They did march on Philadelphia. They had a massive political support. Their primary, one of their primary goals was, of course, not just to massacre the Native people who were interned on that island in Philadelphia's harbor, but also to complain about not being represented in the politics of Pennsylvania and not having sufficient political voice. And of course, that means not having sufficient political voice for their racism, right? So I think that understanding the mechanisms of all of this within the larger political structures is a really important thing for us to try to tackle going forward if we're going to learn anything from these events.
And Dan, if I may continue to add to that, that what was very important for the Circle Legacy people, the native inhabitants of that land, the people that are part of this story, was that they needed someone to speak for them. Because in many cases, there were those who spoke for them without any consultation, who were their voice or excluded them from having a voice in the socio-economic political structure that was around them. In light of what's going on right now with the US Decennial Census going on, back in those days when the first census began, like around 90 or something, the census takers were non-Indian people that did not even count them. Indians weren't counted as real people during the census. And then finally, when laws changed that actually gave them status as human beings, then it was still census people that counted who they were. They would look at someone and say, you look to be a 19-year-old woman of the so-and-so people. And they were their voices. Now, Native people are educated enough to be able to have their own voice, but they're still fighting for an opportunity to have that voice heard, and that their voice has meaning and depth and is listened to and becomes part of the socio-economic political sphere. And I think that this book, as it continues to be presented in the years to come, that story should be also shared with people in the schools like you all are doing so wonderfully to educate people, kids in schools, that this was something that really happened in history. And if it takes a really incredible graphic novel with all of its artwork to get people's attention, kids' attention about true things that happened in history, what I'm hoping for is that it will break the cycle of ignorance, because ignorance begats fear, fear begats racism and the murderous intents of people that don't know any different. They fear change. They fear something's going to be taken away from them. If through this book we can educate a coming generation of people, then by the time they get around to being adults, they are going to assume positions of leadership in our communities. They're going to be the preacher standing up at the pulpit talking to the people in the church. And those people in the church are going to be the mayor, the school board president, the teachers, all of the people who make a community happen. And if they are informed about the history of the land that they are living on and the native people that are there, and they are truly egalitarian like the Quakers are, and say, well, we're not going to do that. We're going to give consideration to all people as we develop socioeconomic political policies, then we can make a difference in combating the base racism and the fear about change that cause people to go wacky. That's what I'm hoping for, that this affects the young people. When they become adults, they become better citizens, they are better informed, and they are more they want to do more for all people and not just for themselves. And that's what I'm hoping stories like this can do, because if we spend our time telling these stories now and sharing it with young people, then 20 years from now, they're going to be leading this country. And the way situation is right now, 20 years from now, this country is going to be run by people who are homeschooled by day drinkers who are hoarding toilet paper.
Well said, although I'm still processing the last part of that.
You know, just picking up on what Curtis just said too, I mean, there's the larger connection that he just alluded to in terms of this is a civics lesson, you know, in the truest sense of the word. You know, it raises questions about citizenship. It raises questions about, you know, a whole array of other moral issues, you know, and as a sidebar, I'll talk to you, Will, about maybe how to connect to some other civics groups that have some larger audiences that they might be able to take this story and then, you know, make, you know, it's like you don't know what you don't know. So if you know that these civics organizations might be able to bring it to their, you know, their clients and the people that they reach to. There's a fairly large organization right there in Philadelphia that connects to, like I said, many other civics related organizations. So nationwide.
It sounds like one thing that we ought to be thinking about is how to continue to tell this story, particularly with K-12 audiences, and then to look for civic angles. Are there other things you'd like to see the library company be doing more broadly? Because we're, of course, an institution that's a lot bigger than me and my little project here. You know, sort of going back to our tradition as one of the earliest libraries and the meeting place of a learning community called the Junto or Leather Apron Club. I mean, what role would you like to see us trying to satisfy in these very precarious times?
The quick answer is no. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Library Company, for providing, you know, me and Gilder Lehrman and the folks that we work with this opportunity. I mean, you know, I don't know if there's much more that the library company can be doing that it has done, which is a great service to be able to bring all these partnerships together and all these, you know, folks together. And, you know, obviously the artist and the, you know, Lee and Washoyet together to make this happen. So, I mean, it's a great start. So.
I suppose I should put on my library company trustee hat here and really just stress how grateful we are to everybody who allowed the library company to have this impact. We had a wonderful exhibition connected with the book. That event we had for the launch when Curtis was there and started us off with a wonderful invocation. I've never seen so many people crowded into the library company building in my life as I saw on that occasion. So I think we've already had a wonderful opportunity to reach out to a broader public and get this message out. And I guess what needs to happen in the future is how do we keep this thing going? How do we not make it a one-time event? And those are issues that I think we all have to talk about, and certainly it involves finding ways to get external support and mobilize people for this this mission moving forward.
It sort of prompts me to give credit where credit is due, and a lot of that owes to Mike Barsanti, who kicked us off today. He really allowed us to take some chances with this project. With the exhibition opening, we had that packed to the gills, to the point that our little HVAC system was really at peak capacity along with our room. You know, the fact that here we are, one of the oldest colonial institutions in America, and we have a Native art exhibition right there when you enter, I think is a really powerful and political act. And the fact that Mike and the rest of the Board of Trustees and our patrons not only allowed me to, but really encouraged me to reuse our facade, because we have all of this glass exposed to the street, and we covered it with these panels of artwork from Washoyet's illustrations that are just arresting. And to see all of these folks that would normally walk past a library company and say, oh, that's not an institution for me, or, you know, I'm not necessarily an early Americanist, so I'm not going to stop there. But to see them pausing in front of the door and taking a photo, or looking at the names of the Conestoga superimposed in front of that Franklin statue that's been with us since the beginning, it was a real risk. And I've been really touched with how generously our community has supported it. And if that has allowed us to try some different things, like we started doing First Fridays, which is a new thing for us, a great opportunity to get some new folks into our doors. I'm grateful to take those on behalf of this project, but also with the understanding that it's something that I hope will be portable, and that other exhibitions will draw upon those strategies, and other staff members will push the boundaries even further. I see we have a couple of questions here. One we have here, we have from Ron and Mary. Curtis, I know you were clearly expressing the racism behind this experience, but greed intended by the Paxton gang was as much of a generator.
Well, yeah, it was to have the land. I mean, that was the greatest. That was the greatest asset that anyone could have, would be control of land. So that's the greed that is a part of a culture that was brought to this continent, that it wasn't a regular thing, let's say, within Native culture, which was more, dare I say the word, socialist in nature, which is for everyone to contribute for the good of the community, for the good of the people, and shared roles and shared responsibilities, and that one doesn't get everything over everyone else. So, and I think that the introduction of greed with a male Eurocentric socio and political environment is what was the downfall of Native people, because they were forced to either live in that environment and change their whole cultural makeup to fit in and to survive, or they didn't survive. And I think that's the downfall of a lot of Native people, is that they've had to change who they are in order to adapt and survive. But in doing so, they took on some of the thought processes that were brought over from Europe, with that whole idea of a king and all of that sort of thing. I mean, let's not forget that even as, and I use that term egalitarian, as the Quakers were, as represented by William Penn, with the treaty at Shakamoxon in 1683 or whatever, excuse me, between William Penn and Tamanin, who led the Lenape delegation. I mean, even that in and of itself, as friendly and as the exchange was, as history shows it, William Penn showed up among the Lenape people carrying a charter from King Charles II that automatically assumed that the land belonged to the king. Not that it belonged to the Lenape, but it belonged to the king. And they didn't have concepts of the sale of land and the like. It was, okay, let's peacefully coexist. Let's occupy this land together. We don't have a problem if all you're going to do is build a little fort and take care of your people. We got lots of room here. Let's live and get along and develop trade and commerce and try to better our lives. But it didn't turn out to be like that. It was not, you know, it might have been presented as that, but it did not turn out to be that way. It was underlying greed and avarice and thought processes that were brought over from Europe that would, again, led to the downfall of the Conestoga and Lenape people. So let's learn from history and change the way we are engaged in socioeconomic politics today. And if what's going on in our world right now doesn't wake us up to start thinking differently, then I don't know what it's going to take. Again, I tried to address that in that beautiful poem as part of my opening prayer. And I'll try to add the link to that prayer so that you can read it again and again. It is so inspiring.
Greed, land hunger, this is all something that's at the core of the experience of this continent ever since the arrival of Europeans, of course. But I just this past week, as I've been moving my undergraduate courses online, we read the Paxton Boys Declaration together with my students. Along with, the same time, we also read an account of the prophet Mcneil and the great prophet of the Pontiac's War at the same time. But as we read that statement of the Paxton Boys, it was really striking, at least to me, and I think to my students, that the Paxton Boys are using the exact same rhetoric that the people that were writing against the Stamp Act at the time were using. They're talking about their loyalty to their king, their need for representation. They're feeling that their voices aren't heard. And it's all the same rhetoric. And this really, I think, points us in a direction of how, in a central way, much of what we call the American Revolution, or the Revolution of the United States, has at its core this land hunger and this desire to conquer native land. And also that it was precisely because in the Proclamation of 1763 and other actions, and in the actions of the Pennsylvania government in trying to act in William Penn's legacy, that for many white American settlers, the problem with the empire and the government before the American Revolution was that it was trying to protect native land. Now, I don't want to say too much about that. I don't want to go too far to say that the Proclamation of 1763 was wonderful, or that the king really had the native people's best interest at heart. But again, the idea that the crown is somehow protecting native people, protecting their land, or at least trying to keep native settlers out of that land, was one of the powerful motivators of the American Revolution. Not the only one, but a powerful one. And I think keeping that in mind, how central these issues are to the very creation of the United States as a political entity, as a social entity, as a cultural entity is something that we really can't stress enough.
A question from a Memrich, which might be just an Emrich, or a master teacher from Gilder Lehrman. I certainly hope so. The question is, what was the feedback from teachers that have used the graphic novel in their classroom? Have you gotten anything back, Ron?
Well, like I said, in both Austin and in California, you know, the initial reception was very exciting. I haven't seen a lot of follow-up, unfortunately. I can't speak to that. But I know that teachers, if they took the time to express what they did during the sessions that we had both in Texas and in California, I'm sure teachers are using it. So I'd have to, I guess, have some follow-up, you know, with some specific folks that I know I could reach out to get specific, you know, more detailed information. So, but I know, like I said, you know, the discussions within the framework of a conference program, you know, it did have a powerful impact on teachers. So
I can say that what I've heard from the teachers is I haven't heard a lot of specifics, but several people wrote and said how wonderfully it worked in their classes and how it was really transformative for them. I haven't had specific feedback, you know, the students said exactly this or said exactly that, but got really positive feedback from that. And I should also say I had a pretty long email conversation with one of the teachers who, quite apart from this specific episode, was really working to get Native voices into her discussions and her lesson plans throughout her year-long course, which was, I think, really one of the things we really want to make sure that people can do. And she was particularly trying to get in one of their sort of reenactment games that they were doing to make sure that the characters in that game were being adequately represented. So I think I get the sense that we've made a real impact with these teachers. And one of the great things about the Gilder Lehrman program is that you know, the teachers go out and they become ambassadors for what they've learned during that week, and we hope it can kind of really begin to spread in that way.
I would add anecdotally that I know that the Shipley School, which is local here in Philadelphia, thanks to the hard work of Mark Statina, who is the 8th grade dean there, they've really embraced Ghost River in their curriculum. And a number of faculty participated in a seminar that I led just this last spring before we closed up. And I know that Mark's class, his students are doing incredible work with it. They did this amazing political cartoon assignment where the students were not only critically evaluating the political cartoons that we have in our collections that were circulating around this whole incident, but then they were creating their own sort of creative forms of cartoons where they were reimagining what these would look like if you were trying to get outside of the Paxton perspective. And some of those students were generous enough to share their artwork. So I had several of them basically act as a curator for our blog posts. We have monthly blog posts for documentation purposes. And so I'm gonna put a little link here in chat to the blog post. It was authored by those tremendous students. You could see not only their artwork, which is, they're far better artists than I am, but their sort of explanation of why they created what they did. And again, remember, these are 8th graders really critically engaging this. And when I was first thinking about this project, I was thinking about it in terms of high schoolers. I didn't know if it would be suitable for 8th graders. And I've heard anecdotally that we have some folks from 4th and 5th grade that are using this book. So it's proving quite useful in a lot of different circumstances. Here's a question from Quinn. Although it is impossible to repair the violence whites inflicted on American Indians for hundreds of years, what can the US government do to help Native tribes improve their political and economic standing without forcing assimilation?
Well, it is, I don't know how to, look, treaty obligations that have transformed from the days when wagon trains would show up with flour and lard and beans and as a way of feeding Native people that were herded into little areas that became known as reservations. That has transformed into this whole new world of of thriving tribal governments that are trying to create infrastructure to take care of themselves. But that does not negate the obligation that was made in treaties to provide for the essential health, education, and welfare of Native people in return for giving up all of that land, forcibly or not. Yet today, Congress, who is the body that administers that government to government relationship, along with the executive branch, which is the president, the Department of Interior, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Like any political cycle, they're made up of people who have control of the purse strings. And when they take a decades-old attitude that oftentimes maybe they were informed by the old movies and TV shows of the 40s and the 50s and even the 60s, and they had this notion of who Indian people were, they continue to make sure that just the bare minimum of government resources go to support so-called Indian obligations. What we're going to have to do is, in order for the federal government and America as a whole to fulfill agreements, expectations, and fairness to the Native people of this land who will not go away, then in their deliberations within the Congress and within the executive branch, that they consult with and work with Native people in order to provide for them and not simply repeat the cycle that has continued generation after generation. I thought things were getting better, but goodness, really, over the last, over the last at least 15 years, it's slowly degrading once again. And with the way things are going on right now with this whole coronavirus thing, stimulus money and all of this, I'm very concerned that, again, Indians are in the back of the line fighting for the crumbs while others are seated at the table feasting. And what I'm additionally worried about is that with all of this coronavirus thing going on, that you have people that still have the old greedy attitudes that are running significant parts of this government, and they are sneaking in ways of getting all of that money, sharing it themselves, and throwing away any rules and protections. And I'm going to say right now, having to do with environmental protections on lands. I think they're using the cover of this coronavirus thing to go in and suddenly, keep people away because the virus might kill them, but we're going to continue to build these pipelines. And guess what? Pipelines are typically run through lands that oftentimes are lands of Indian people. And without their permission, these pipelines are built, and we have discovered that oil and gas pipelines rupture and cause environmental damage. But guess who's left to clean it up? The Indian people have to clean up their own land. So, we should learn these lessons, and we should hold the people that we put in power accountable and guide them to have a greater good in their intentions to take care of not just Indian people, but all people. But that's how they can work better, is to consult and work with the tribes. We know how to take care of ourselves. We just need the help and support and the partnership, equal partnership in the way we conduct socioeconomic policy in the United States.
Well said. If I could just point us back to Ghost River one last time, or not one last time, but point us back to one of the, what I show its powerful images in that book is of the wampum belt that represented the treaty obligations of the Pennsylvania government to these people. And that wampum belt, of course, was found in the ashes of the village.
Thank you for bringing that in, Dan.
Yep.
Curtis, I've got another question for you, which I'm happy to talk about as well. Could Curtis or others on the panel talk about how the Delaware peoples still living in the area were involved in the project?
Well, I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. The Delaware people as a whole involved in this project, I, based on my career and the work that I do, both as the cultural and historic director for the Delaware Tribe of Indians and as a co-founding board member for the Lenape Center, I brought my collective career experience into this advisory role. And I've gained that knowledge by my interaction with the Delaware people over the last 35 years. So I don't believe that there was any effort to have a town hall meeting and tell everybody, hey, this book is being written, what do you think we should say? I think I just brought my own professional and personal experience and expertise to this after having been informed by many different Delaware communities, both in the United States and in Canada.
And to supplement that answer, I mean, because of Curtis's connection that he made for us with the Circle Legacy Center, we had folks from Lenape people locally that participated in a number of different readings of the book. I shared the actual graphic novel in different forms, including I shared the original pencils, the inked pages, the colored pages, a couple of different iterations of the script. And if you go through the graphic novel, be it in the print edition or the digital edition, which you'll hear more about later, you'll see that there's an annotated script in the back. And you could see where we got comments and where we had conversations about the editorial process. And of course, there's a lot of Curtis because he was one of our most generous readers. There are some comments from Dan, who helped keep us careful with our historiography, and many, many other folks who locally participated. So I would encourage folks to really spend some time with that back matter, because that's something where we had to make a choice in terms of the size of this book. It wasn't a huge book. We wanted to keep it small so it could be inexpensive and easy to ship and produce. But we set aside about 25 pages for that annotated script so that we could open up the process. I'm gonna play our documentary video that Ron had alluded to, which I think is really powerful. It's about 10.5 minutes long, and it was developed by Mangrove Media. Thank you all for joining. What we call the Paxton Incident is really two massacres. First at Conestoga Indian Town, a reservation set aside by William Penn with the founding of Pennsylvania. And then a second, the workhouse, where the remaining fleeing Conestoga were taken in and then murdered in broad daylight. At libraries like the Library Company of Philadelphia, which have a long colonial history, we need to be doing more outreach. We need to be conveying the stakes of our work to a wider audience. And so one of the things that I sought out when I was looking for an author and an artist was folks that had done work that felt like it reconceived historical material with the urgencies of today.
My tribe is the Tongva tribe of California. It's all Los Angeles Basin, Pasadena area, Hollywood, basically the center of Southern California.
Weshoyo's art, every page is different from the one before it. She is somebody who's constantly looking to challenge herself.
I honestly had never heard of this event. It really kind of sparked my interest, like, wow, why didn't I learn about this in school? And wow, why don't I know about this? I said, if I'm chosen to work on this project, I hope that you would maybe consider Lee to write it.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we're so glad to have you here at the Indigenous Comic-Con. Please enjoy your afternoon and have a wonderful time.
Lee has effectively made Native American comics what they are today. He started the only Native American comic shop in the country. He founded Indigenous Comic-Con.
We brought together folks from all sorts of genres that came together to celebrate this forward-thinking Indigenous identity.
The thing with the Paxton Massacre and the redrawing history, we're being allowed the freedom to write about that incident from an Indigenous voice and to give voices to the people that were involved in that and shed light on a very dark historical event.
At the beginning of this project, we did a number of field trips, research trips with Wishoyo and Lee to ensure that they had a sense not only of the people, but the place that they were going to be writing and exploring in this graphic novel.
What we're talking about here is long before any of these buildings were here, long before these concrete sidewalks or these roads.
I think the highlight for all of us was our trip to Lancaster. We had a chance to go to the historical site of Conestoga Indian Town.
When we went to the ancient site, the original site of the Susquehannock people, it's in a suburb, you know, it's surrounded by all these little built-up houses. It's a historical area, so they can't build on it.
So they kind of have it disguised as a park. If you actually know it's there, you're like, wow, no, this is a village site. You start thinking about the people that had lived there before and the ways that they lived off the land, and it allows you to sort of connect a little bit, I think, with the environment.
And I always like to try and look around to get as much of a sense as I can of what it would have been like when there were no houses around there, and it would have been all forested with the river running in the background.
I went out and I kind of offered some tobacco as like a thank you for letting us, you know, be in this space, and then also as a remembrance of those people.
I saw how Wishoyo was just captivated by this burial mound that had been sort of capped off, and there was this little tuft of trees on top. And there was something so lonely about those trees, and I know that she was responding to it at a really sort of visceral level.
So I create kind of a theme between them taking those trees off of that hill in present time and those, 20 people that were butchered.
How many places did we drive past that are the sites of these kinds of stories? I suspect that many of those farmers have no idea what has happened in that very land. It could be anywhere in this country, and that really forces us to reevaluate our relationship with this land. After these atrocities, the Pennsylvania proprietors, the government, decided to basically take in all of the indigenous peoples that were anywhere nearby, which included Lenni Lenape and Moravian Indians, basically because they feared this snowballing. The Paxton Boys vowed to inspect, which really meant to menace those indigenous peoples where they were, which was in Philadelphia. And they got as near to those people as Germantown, 6 miles north of Philadelphia, where they were met by a militia and a delegation led by Benjamin Franklin, who persuaded them through eloquence and through force that they ought to disband and to publish their grievances. And so then the next year became a print debate.
I remember looking at, it was one of the political cartoons, and it's got a Quaker and, they're handing weapons to the native folks.
It's a depiction of Quakers being sort of seduced by these half-naked Native American women who are literally robbing them.
A Native woman is stealing a man's watch out of his waistcoat.
And she's got this low-cut dress, and her bosoms are, right over the top of that. And it's supposed to be sort of like how nativeness conned the Quakers into, being allies. Native women as the seductress, Native women as the exoticized. And I was particularly thrown by that. Nowadays, 1 in 3 Native women are assaulted in their lifetimes. Missing murder in Indigenous women are numbering in the 5,000 plus, and there's no popular media for Native women. And it goes all the way back to 1763, 1764.
It sort of draws upon this fear of Native sexuality, and of course, this idea of miscegenation, this fear that the races were mixing in their backyard. Pennsylvania as a colony was comprised of so many different ethnic groups that really didn't see eye to eye, and those included Germans, English, and Scots-Irish Presbyterians. And it wasn't really until the debate about this incident that you started to see a shared white identity emerge in opposition to this racial other. And so much of this debate is about borders and about the sense that there's an enemy in your midst. And you can't tell the good ones from the bad ones, so they all need to go.
One thing that we are trying to definitely bring across, not only with the script, but referencing the pamphlets and the political cartoons, is how they were used as political propaganda.
The natives as basically a prop in this warfare between two opposing sides, the frontierists and the colonialists, right, the Quakers.
Everybody had their own agenda, and this quickly became a story not about the conduct of the Paxton men, but a story about governance in Pennsylvania.
When we went to the American Philosophical Society, they brought out this wampum belt.
Many of the Iroquois and Algonquin people used wampum belts as symbols of establishing treaties, as currency. They were used as documents of identification.
Amazing. It's beautiful. Yeah, this is going to be the repetitive motif, right? And I have an idea about how it can play too.
Nice.
You want to grab your...
We had really put off talking about this one scene, which is really difficult to write because it's one of gratuitous violence. It's the scene in Lancaster when the remaining Susquehannock are murdered.
The scene that I put together with that was essentially a scene of Native people that didn't scream, that didn't cry, but that faced that head on. I wanted to change that dynamic so that it wasn't Natives being victimized, but that they knew what was coming. They knew what was going to happen and they accepted that. And that everybody dies on their feet, and that's a huge thing for me.
We didn't want to wallow in sensationalized violence.
We chose to sort of use some visual metaphors that tie back into the tribe's material culture in a way to visualize it without it being just, the sheer violence that actually did occur. Because the ways that those people, were killed, it's horrendous.
Individuals are transformed into wampum beads. This attack is the rending, the final tearing of this wampum belt, this symbol of colonial indigenous harmony. When people talk about the 1763 massacre, they often call it the Paxton Boys, March, Rebellion. These weren't boys, these were grown men, they were murderers. And to disconnect this story from the Paxton Boys and instead to foreground the indigenous people at the center of this story, I think is a real act of defiance.
Most Native people in this country, when they faced the types of displacement, ethnocide, and genocide, they didn't have a newspaper where they could tell their own particular story.
I think a lot of the issues people have with Native people are we have already been obliterated or we are extinct.
There are all sorts of folks that identify as descendants of the Susquehannock, and you have an obligation to the living.
Indigenous identity continues to be something that's mythologized. When we dive into the humanity of individuals and people, we start to break out of the mythology of that.
One of the key things that me and Lee have both worked on together in this project is focusing on positive representation that we are still here, and huge emphasis on the resiliency that we have as a people to carry on through generations, and despite so many bad things happening to us, we are still here and we're still trying to present ourselves in a positive way.